for me, you cannot have hiring excellence across any part of the process without not just transparency, but clarity. So not just I can see it, but I can see it and I know what it means.
Welcome to Offer Accepted, the podcast that elevates your recruiting game. Your host, Shannon Ogborn, interviews top talent acquisition leaders, uncovering their secrets to building and leading successful recruiting teams. Gain valuable insights and actionable advice, from analyzing cutting-edge metrics to claiming your seat at the table. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Offer Accepted. I am Shannon Ogborn, and this episode is brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform empowering ambitious teams from seed to IPO and beyond. We are so lucky because today we have the incredible Luke Eaton, who is a 13-year recruiting leader working with organizations as a talent leader and de facto head of talent to stand up TA functions from the ground up. Luke, thank you so much for joining us on Offer Accepted.
Absolute pleasure to be here. I wouldn't call myself incredible. I prefer fantastic, but thank you very much for the intro.
Synonyms. Would love for you to give our listeners a little bit of background on yourself. I know you're doing some interesting things right now. So can you tell us a little bit more about your current work, what you're currently up to?
Yeah, sure. So hello, everyone. I'm Luke, and I'm currently working with a company called Welltech, which is a health and wellness software company based out of Ukraine, which is got some interesting recruitment challenges, as you can imagine. And my role is to stand up the talent acquisition function when it comes to processes, systems, tools, best practices, and just get them to a point where they can hire at scale and reduce the level of effort to make a hire so TA doesn't grow at the same rate as the revenue generating part of the business, and also to enable recruiters with data. So empower them with the data that they need to, yes, make more hires for the same level of effort, but just as importantly, for the same number of hires, do it with less effort. Go pick your kids up from school, go to the gym, go spend some time with your family, or whatever it is that makes you a well-rounded recruiter that stays at Welltech for years and years and years. And we're not just squeezing every hire out of them for the sake of it. But for the course of my career for the past sort of 7 or 8 years, my role has essentially been to embed into businesses that are usually going through sort of pre-seed to Series A, Series B investment, stand them up from a functional perspective as a head of TA, and just make sure that their TA function is ready for scale, and make sure that their people function isn't a blocker to growth and therefore the milestones to their investment. Before I got into recruitment, I was actually a magician for 10 years, if you can believe that. I was a professional magician.
That's awesome.
Going around Europe for companies like Coke and Sony, doing interesting sort of product launches and things with magic. Before then, I was a croupier. Before then, I was a window cleaner. And then that's me right up to childhood. So I'll stop there.
That is definitely an interesting background on the recruiting end, especially as you have, over the last several years, come into an organization and try to help them build stuff from the ground up. What challenges have you seen really present themselves in the TA space, especially as of late?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can only speak to my own experience, which is very kettled into that growing sort of hyper-scaling business, either through investment or just through just vast profitability. But if I could boil down what are the key problems that I see, or the key challenges that need to be overcome, it's very much that as the business scales, the operational side, the non-revenue generating bit, can't scale to the same degree. Can't do that. You're never going to get investment. You're never going to IPO. You're never going to pass an audit. You're never going to make a profit. All of those things. So the key problem that I see for TA is that the only solution for hyperscaling problems is just throwing massive amounts of human capital at the problem. More recruiters making more hires, when in actual fact, the real way to support a hyperscaling business has to be by reducing the level of effort to make a hire by an order of magnitude. And you don't do that by throwing more people at it. You do it like any other process. You use tools, systems, processes, best practices. And that's not just for TA. If you were on a building site, you wouldn't hire 10 builders if you could hire one builder and give them power tools. right? That is how you scale an individual's labor. And it's the exact same thing with TA. So what TA leaders really and businesses really have to empower in TA is the ability to draw data from their processes, to be able to see what is and isn't working across the business, to be able to look at their volumes, conversions, and capacities at every stage so they can spot bottlenecks that affect the throughput to their business, and then be able to then forecast and say, well, what specific low-level tasks do we need to do this quarter to improve conversion or reduce the level of effort? And if you do that in aggregate over a period of years during a scaling journey, then that's how you get the revenue generating stuff doing this, and then TA just growing very, very slowly. So every individual recruiter has got the maximum amount of value. And then, we're not in sticky situations where there's large redundancy pieces and all these other awful things where businesses haven't thought about that. So I'd say that's like the clear winner in terms of the biggest issue, is even getting businesses to view TA as a strategic function so they can even start solving that problem, never mind actually going about solving it. So I'd say that's probably the key issue I've seen in most hyperscaling tech companies over the past 7 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Being a trusted advisor as a recruiting team can take some effort to get to, and instilling the proper processes so that you can build trust amongst your stakeholders is super important. I know that we had sort of discussed one of the ways to best optimize a recruiting process is to really think about the marginal gains. What marginal gains can you gain from each part of the process? Can you explain a little bit more about what you're thinking about when you refer to marginal gains?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, it's not a new fancy concept, right? Marginal gains, or the aggregation of marginal gains, comes from car manufacturing. It's about 60, 70 years old, using sort of lean and the theory of constraints to drive improvements through a process. And up until about 20 years ago, software engineers used it. So we have DevOps engineers. They rapidly increase the cadence to which they release software by identifying and elevating bottlenecks in the software release process. So now we have DevOps. And recruitment hasn't actually gone through that process yet. So marginal gains is essentially that if you take a lot of small improvements through a process, that adds up to a massive improvement down at the bottom. Now, one of the best examples of this is actually not even in recruitment, it's actually in sports. Cycling teams, they literally look at every individual little element, even how clean the car is that transports the bikes to the stadium. If any dirt from the car gets into the gears, that's a marginal gain, that them not having that problem. So they look at that minute level of detail, and when they add it all up, it equates to this massive championship team. So from a recruitment point of view, well, you need to be able to see what you're improving. So let's say funnel metrics, what's the conversion and the volume at every stage of a recruitment process? And then marginal gains is essentially a recruitment leader saying, right, how do we get our outreach to screen 4% better this quarter? How do we get our screen to the early stage tech test or whatever 4% better? How do we get the interview 4% better? Final interview, offer, hire, withdrawal rate, all of those things. And if you, rather than thinking, how do we double the amount of people, or how do we double the amount of people going through the interview process, which can be unrealistic from a practical point of view, there's probably ways to increase something by 4%. But if you take that 4% all the way down, you end up with 50, 60, 70, 80% increase in hires at the bottom of the funnel. And the best benefit is that it's realistic. These things can be done in a quarter, and then you can kick off a cycle of continuous improvement, right? What was the next 4% going to come from? What was the next 4% after that? So that's kind of what marginal gains is, where it comes from, and a kind of a rough tour of how it can be used practically in TA.
Definitely. It sounds like you're sort of like bringing these mature processes from other businesses or other industries and applying them to recruiting.
That's exactly it. And, the lean and the theory of constraints is one of the main preoccupations of myself over the past few years, because I've seen the benefit and I understand the significant need for it as TA functions help support scaling businesses. But, I think that TA is not being a strategic function yet. It's not really known across the world of sort of work as a strategic function compared to, say, finance, right? Or whatever revenue generating bit of the business is, engineering, say. And I think there's not just that, but project management. If your recruiters took a project management course, their requirement gathering in that kickoff call is going to be amazing, because they know how to break things down into must-haves versus nice-to-haves. They know how to clarify requirements and break ambiguous things into specific requirements. You can kind of just see all the different, much more mature bits of business, and we can borrow from all of these other bits of business and use it in recruitment. But I would say that the use of data and the way we improve processes is something that is desperately needed from a TA point of view. And that's why it's something that's quite become my preoccupation in my career.
Definitely. And I think it's so interesting because a lot of companies right now in particular are talking about doing more with less, or doing more with what is essentially the same. And a lot of companies have turned to tools to do this, but there are ways to do this on the personnel side as well. And we talked a little bit about how you can really optimize these marginal gains using the best person in a specialty area so that everyone can be coached in their area of expertise and everyone wins. You don't have to add significantly more recruiters. And if you're not in a position where you can bring on more tools, like this is a great way to still optimize on these marginal gains. Can you tell me a little bit more about what is needed to set people up for success tactically in using people's specialty areas to optimize on these marginal gains?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question, because we see, when we think about marginal gains, the first thing we talk about is process, right? Process improvement. And we think, well, what about that? That's something that maybe recruitment managers, TA leaders speak to, heads of business, CEOs, founders about. But in actual fact, that very same data, there's not two separate things. It's the same data, but with a different use case. Performance management is just an excellent tool for performance management. So if not just the business has a kind of a broad funnel and a broad view of where our capacities and where our bottlenecks and volumes, if every individual recruiter has access to their own data and is empowered to track that data for the business, but they can also see it for themselves, for the team, per role, for instance, then you can see what's your individual funnel, where are your individual conversions at, and then the individual recruiter can be empowered to make their own marginal gains in their own game, right? So what am I lagging in? How can I improve whatever by 4%, this by 4%, that by 4%, just as I said before, but at the individual level. But in a team setting, it's really excellent for the recruitment manager. So I'm talking like the mid-tier manager, the people that the absolute lifeblood of TA leadership, doing the hard work of, mentoring, coaching. If you have a table of conversions of your teams of recruiters, then yes, you can take it upon yourself for some top-down training. But I've managed 22 recruiters in one go across 6 locations. I cannot, unless I give up every other responsibility, manage and coach every recruiter to the degree of quality that I would like to. So there has to be a kind of a bottom-up approach. And when the data is transparent and the recruiters are empowered to use that data for their own improvements, then something really awesome happens in the one-to-ones. So essentially, let's say you've got a bunch of recruiters, they can see their data, they can see other people's data. Well, someone who's got, say, a poor or a below average offer to outreach to screen conversion, let's say something simple, they can see who's really, really good at that. And what's the first thing a recruiter's going to do? If you see that, you're going to go up to that person and be like, mate, what on earth are you saying to these candidates that's getting twice as many people back to you? Like, can I use your nurture campaigns? Like, can you show me? Can you mentor me? And this happens across every single stage for every single recruiter. So they start raising the floor of each other. They start raising each other up. And you see it as a manager. And I've implemented this across multiple businesses of different sizes. You see like a light bulb moment for these recruiters where they're coming to one-to-ones with ideas for improvements. And then it's just my job to like mark homework and say, yeah, that's a great idea. Let me know how it can help. Instead of me saying, here's the data. Do you see why this is bad? Do you see what you need to do? This is why this is good. So you're ending up, instead of bringing 20 odd people up a hill, they're bringing each other up the hill, and you just have to sort of enable it and encourage it as much as possible. And of course, then you can formalize that learning, like lunch and learns. If you had like a slot for lunch and learns, maybe once a week, 30 minutes, everyone's eating a sandwich, having a coffee or whatever in the middle of the day, you can pick someone who is, who can kind of be the curator and responsible for a specific conversion or a specific stage that they're very good at, and they can deliver that to the team in a more formal way. So it's the exact same data, the same very basic stuff. You could use a Google spreadsheet and you can track volume, conversion, capacity at every stage. And you can use that kind of performance management to that degree. So, but one other thing to say is that I think recruiters in general, individual contributing recruiters, particularly they come out of agency environments, kind of have kind of like a toxic relationship with data. They can have the data to them is maybe arbitrary KPIs. We've all been in that. If you've been in the agency space, 10 BD calls before 10 a.m., this many outreach. If you don't do it, you don't pass probation. So the first thing you have to do as a leader with this data isn't even just say, hey, look at all this cool stuff. They're just going to see them as KPIs. You have to show them that this is a tool that empowers them, that they can use. No one's going to hit them over the head with this data. This is an empowerment tool. So actually rehabilitating data's reputation among individual prescription recruiters is a really important way to kick that off.
On the note of culture, I think it's really interesting you bring that up, because I was thinking about that as you were talking. There's a lot of companies, and the companies that I've even worked for, that have a philosophy of not being transparent with data because they fear that it's going to create some like toxic competitiveness instead of, encouraging people to talk to each other about what they're doing well and right. How do you, as a recruiting leader, create a culture around, this data transparency being an uplifter instead of a competitive mess? Because I think that can happen if the culture around it isn't right.
I think that's a really, really good point. And I think that's a key piece of how do you sort of govern that change. Let's say this group knows that it's a good idea, but how do you get people who, earlier in their careers understanding, particularly if they come out of more toxic environments? So I think first and foremost, just the act of making the data transparent, I think that has a massive impact on their ability. Most recruiters are, all recruiters are smart, capable, emotionally intelligent. So if you give them that transparency, they can kind of read between the lines, and they know that, there's a less of an arbitrary nature to the data. And recruiters are very curious. So if you give them all the data, they will get into it. They will enjoy learning. What does this mean? What does that mean? How can I improve this? But it has to be followed up in public, in the open. So if you have any weekly rituals with the team, it has to be explained what's happening, but it also has to be followed up on an individual basis in the one-to-one. So if you're using it as a tool of performance management, then performance manage with that tool, right? So in the one-to-ones, what do you want to talk about? Everything that you need to do is that for protected time, that protected 30 minutes as a leader, but you communicate it through that data. So, what's volume been like? What are the blockers? What do you want to improve on? The very fact that I'm asking the question, what would you like to improve, rather than me saying, this is bad. If you don't do this, then this bad thing happens. And it's very transactional and negative. If you can say, here's the data, let's get stuck in, right? What do you want to improve? And the best thing about that is, of course, a lot of these improvements tie into the wider business. vision. The same data I'm using to performance manage, I'm going to go into another meeting with the co-founder and say, right, here's the data we're going to use to improve your process in Q1 and in Q2 and reduce that level of effort and all that good stuff that I was saying earlier. So the very fact that I can say this thing that you're going to improve is part of a wider project that I would like you to be part of. So all immediately you can start identifying stretch goals for your recruiters. So you want something that they can do about 80% of, and then the other 20% you can coach. By the end of the quarter, they move forward in terms of their skills or experience. They feel they're moving forward. Attrition goes down, all that good stuff, right? Everyone's happy. So I think you just have to use it as a leader, as a performance management tool. Don't be afraid of it. Totally transparent. And then use it in your one-to-ones to enable their growth.
And it also helps with accountability. I know some companies and some leaders fear that people are going to start getting anxiety if they can see everybody else's or people can see theirs. But, a lot of times if you see someone on your team struggling, you could even proactively reach out to them and say, hey, I see you're better at this than me. I'm a little bit above you in this area. Why don't we kind of like trade ideas and bounce ideas off of each other so that we can both succeed? And that's the point, right? Like we want our whole team to succeed. That's how you get the most out of your team, is that everyone feels like you want them all to succeed, not you want your favorite recruiter to succeed or you want the person who's already doing well to succeed. Like the best way to get all those marginal gains aggregated to a huge impact is to bring everyone up.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And that's it. Marginal gains isn't just like down a funnel. As you say, it can be across recruiters. And if what we do isn't rocket science, right? It's hard, but it's not difficult. I don't know what the phrase is, but essentially, we're not rocket scientists. So if someone is doing something really well, that's not some magic patent that they have on something, right? They're either asking really good questions that we can copy and that they can train. They're sending really good emails that they can literally physically copy, right, and use. They're calling people at certain times. These are relatively simple acts, but they just has to be done with some experience and some know-how. So yeah, if there's someone who has an outreach to screen conversion that's like 15% and another person's is 10, of course I want those people to get together. And if everyone's conversion is then at the highest, at the close to the person who's the absolute tip top of that, then yeah, problem solved. And again, always think about how is this impacting in aggregate across a whole business during a scaling period of 4 years where they quadruple the size of the business. What does this do to the level of effort to make it higher and therefore the cost per hire? It's bringing it down. And that's why I think, recruiting leaders have to tackle this head on, because it's the only actual practical way to plod towards that goal. There's no magic bullet, as you say. Just having the data isn't enough. You have to actually have that firm purpose of reducing that level of effort to make the most efficient, scalable recruitment team.
For sure. And one thing that I was just thinking about as you were talking is, what happens when someone does something with a completely different style, right? Like someone on your team may be successful because they're using a method that works for them. What would you recommend in that situation? For example, like I felt like, for me as a recruiter, I like took my time a lot more with candidates. I probably moved a little bit slower, but like my acceptance rate was so high, so much higher than my colleagues, because I felt like I was a little bit more focused on building rapport. And so I didn't have to have as many candidates at the top of the funnel because I was so good at that bottom part. Can a recruiter be good at all of the parts of the funnel?
That's an interesting question, because we're talking about good and bad in context, right? So you're talking about, good and bad of your own personal game. Well, if everything comes up by 4%, but you're still amazing at offer accept, you're still helping that business achieve that massive strategic goal, right? So yeah, you can be good at everything, because you just have to know how to do everything to a higher degree. But there's always going to be some things that speak to you personally and like your voice. I was very, very much the same. When in my recruiting days, I was excellent at the sort of candidate engagement, sort of mid-funnel. I was good at interview prep because I was relatively techie. So I really could contextualize what they're about to walk into. And they would walk into their tech interviews through me feeling like rock stars, right? Feeling amazing. And I had the best interview conversion at that level. So then people started shadowing me. I started doing kind of tech stuff for our recruiters. So that, for me, the fact that we have a non-arbitrary set of criteria for all recruiters, that your amazing conversion would stick out like a sore thumb. And I'd be super curious, like, oh, what on earth is Shannon doing, right? Like, I want to know. So people are going to get in touch with you and ask you. They'll get you with you on Slack and be like, what are you saying to these people? Like, let me know. What, like, can you teach me? So I don't think that doing this is not an effort to make everyone some kind of mulchy, kind of homogenous blob of recruiters. It's more a way of everyone knowing that we're all moving towards the same goal. And any KPIs that are set, they can literally see how they're set. We've got the goal here. Here are the conversions. Here's the level of effort. And this is how you break it down per recruiter and per week. I'm not just some random person saying, give me 80 or outreach a week or whatever it is. Like you could do it with less, but you'd have to increase the conversion somewhere else. So they start to actually see the mechanics of it. And then all of a sudden they realize that it's not arbitrary. And, for you yourself, if that was your way of doing things, I'm sure you had a lot more time, top of the funnel. You had like less things to worry about daily when it comes to sourcing strategies and things like this. So you can see how that would diminish your game in other ways. So yeah, I don't want to kind of waffle, but for me, having that clear, very non-arbitrary set of criteria is empowering, irrespective of sort of your methods.
Yeah, it's less. I feel like less about how you're getting there, because every recruiter does things a little bit differently, but there are things to be learned from other recruiters. And if it doesn't work for you, then it doesn't work for you. And that's fine. And you can do things that feel more authentic to you, but it is always helpful to at least hear what the other person is doing and decide for yourself if that's something that you feel like you can integrate into your personal strategy and style.
I completely agree. I work with a recruiter I'm very friendly, as you could probably tell. I'm very chatty, right? Friendly. But I spoke with a recruiter who, if you were on his screen, if you shadowed his screen, it sounded like he did not care about this candidate. But he had some of the best NPS scores for the candidates. And it's because he came across to the candidate as someone who was no nonsense, knew his business, respected that person's time, didn't want to waste any time, was very professional, and candidates absolutely loved him. And he was much more able to influence at the offer accept stage because he felt that it was like he was talking to the lawyer or an accountant, right? He was just very to the point. I could never do that because I would feel awful, right? Because it's not in my character, but you could see it in the conversions. Every behavior would create a different number of people going forward, and you can see it in the data. So as long as I can see it in the data and there's no bias to it, then I don't mind the personality as long as they're empowered by the data to achieve the goals. It's way better than some recruitment manager who's just totally arbitrary, basing decisions based on, how that person recruited back in the 90s. We've all had that type of leader. It's way better to just say, here's the data. How are we going to achieve these results with starting at this point?
Definitely. Yeah, I think all of this getting to the marginal gains is really the best way to enhance your process without really having to spend more, which is what companies are focused on now. My sort of last question on this bit is, I'm very curious if there is one. If there's not, then that makes total sense. But if was one piece of the funnel that you think you can get the biggest marginal gain out of, what do you think that is?
Well, I don't see it in that way because they're all linked up. So for me, the further down the funnel, the more waste there is when that person doesn't get hired. So for me, I just see like an area diagram in my brain of money going down a drain. So if we're making mistakes at the offer level, then the cost per hire, like the hidden operational cost of a hire was, say, $3,000. I don't mean the total cost per hire, of course. I mean just the time it would take the recruiters to get someone to the offer stage, the engineers, all of that sign off, everything. Like, that's probably about a couple of $1,000. And I've calculated for some businesses, and it is between sort of $1,000, $3,000, right? Just to get a candidate to an offer stage. So every time we don't get back to a candidate with a decision to make an offer, we leave them hanging over the weekend instead of just having a decision in session with a stakeholder on a Friday, which I always recommend doing for that reason. If there's a long and lengthy and manual process for getting salary exemptions and things approved, all of these things that mean that our offer accept rate, it goes from, say, 80% down to, it can vary wildly quarter to quarter because it's a smaller data set, but it can go down to, 60%. Then you're wasting thousands of dollars because we just didn't have a tight game when it came to managing an offer, which, even though it's an important part of the process, the only part of the process that isn't soft and ambiguous and require emotionally intelligent people. Like we put in an X amount of data, we do Y things to the data, and then we send the candidate, a document with X and Y data. It's not rocket science. So for me, it has to be at the offer accept rate. Like, so many factors affect the candidate's decision to accept that offer, and it's the bit where we have the most risk of the most waste. So there's another whole other podcast about talking about improving offer accept, but I would just say at that stage, you need every piece of information you would need to send the candidate the offer at the offer call with the candidate, total transparency, let them go through the entire feedback, the good stuff and the bad stuff, because there's authenticity there, so the candidates don't feel like they're being sold. You just tell them the good stuff, they just literally think you're lying to them because
you are
perfect, right? Yeah, exactly. But if you say, look, this is what, this is why we want to make you an offer. This is the stuff that we were concerned about. We'll factor this into the L&D for your probation period. This is real. This is authentic. It's a 3-dimensional thing that can visualize themselves going to work. I don't want to go off on a whole other podcast of tangents, but I would say that the thing to focus on is bottom of the funnel, up the way. It's the most important. The changes have the biggest impact on cost per hire and level of effort.
Yeah, makes total sense. Well, I would love to hear about your take on hiring excellence. So we talk a lot about hiring excellence at Ashby, and I always love to hear from people in the space. Like, what does hiring excellence mean to you?
Yeah, I'm really bad at these kind of high level questions. Like, if you give me something low level and geeky, I'm in there. But I've done my best. And if I could sort of harness it down to one criteria, it would be clarity. Fundamentally, what's our goal, right? We're exchanging effort and skills for money, and we're doing it at scale. And all of that is really ambiguous. Every part of it is an ambiguous exchange. The exchange between the hiring manager and their leader when it comes to what they actually want in the first place before they can write the hiring plan down. There's an ambiguity there. So it's not quite what's in the hiring manager's head, right? There's an ambiguity between the hiring manager and the recruiter. What the intake, like what they think they need, what they think the market's like, what they think they can get for their budget. We've all been in that situation where someone wants, a Ferrari for the price of a Volkswagen Lupo. So there's that situation. And then there's the ambiguity between the recruiter and the material that they put out into the world, job posts. And there's the ambiguity through the process and between the recruiter and the candidate. So the whole thing is very, very, very fluffy, but we have a very, very specific, very strategic and strategically important business goal. So for me, you cannot have hiring excellence across any part of the process without not just transparency, but clarity. So not just I can see it, but I can see it and I know what it means. So for employer branding, clarity, people I have a clear idea of not just what do we have pizza parties and all that fun stuff, but what are our problem spaces, what we're currently working on. If you give an engineer the problem, they're more likely to join because engineers' minds enjoy problems. That's why they're engineers. DE&I, what are we bad at in DE&I? What are we embarrassed about? What are we working on currently? Not just what's our diversity statement on the website. What are we aware? Are we self-aware of where our bias is to a degree? And what are we actually trying to do to become a company of diverse thought and background? And of course, just basic ambiguities within the business, right? How do we get clarity between what a recruiter sees and what a recruiter knows and what a hiring manager needs? So you could pick any piece of recruitment and you will not get hiring excellence from employer branding right through to basic workforce planning without a significant effort to reduce ambiguity and achieve sort of clarity between all those different parties. I hope that was a decent enough answer because I suck at those types of answers.
No, that's totally good. It kind of reminds me of a really bad game of telephone. You know, if you can't hear the other person, in this case, it would be like you just don't understand it. And then you're passing along the message down the line, and then it's completely incorrect by the time you get, from the hiring manager to the candidate. And so that's not going to be helpful for hiring the person who's most aligned with what the hiring manager or the business really needs. So yes, that made total sense to me.
Good.
So last question, my favorite question of all. What is your recruiting hot take?
Okay, we've already discussed this. I'm really bad at hot takes because I've seen so many of them and almost none of them are hot takes. But I also don't want to say something that's going to get anyone into trouble. So hopefully this is hot enough. Maybe it's like a mid-level curry, but not a vindaloo. So my hot take is essentially, well, I'll give you the context to the hot take and then I'll tell you what it is. Okay, so imagine you're in a restaurant and you go up into the restaurant and you say to the maitre d', I want the best meal I've ever had in my life. And I want it for the lowest price point. Okay, bit of a bossy customer, but a lot of restaurants can do that. So you got to sit them down and they go, oh, hang on, I also want to be the person who cooks the meal. I don't want the Michelin star chef to make the best meal in the world. I want to be the one to make it. Well, no restaurant can possibly achieve that, right? Because you're taking away the one thing that makes the good meal. Hiring managers, I don't think hiring managers should be anywhere near the recruitment process at all. Aside from telling me what they want on the menu and making the decision what they want on the menu, they should not be in the kitchen. And I think we see this a lot. If you look at any of the sort of recruitment issues that are common in a lot of businesses, it's when a hiring manager, they will write feedback down that is not evidence-based. They will run unstructured interviews. Like look at the McKinsey data on that. Like you're immediately 40% like loss in quality of candidate experience and whatnot just by running an unstructured interview to a structured interview. But they get away with it, right? Because no one's really drilled any governance into this part of the process. So we need a RACI chart, and in the R is the recruiter, and in the A, accountable, is the hiring manager. But hiring managers should not be anywhere near. And I know we want to partner with hiring managers and bring them into the process, but you make the decision. I'll tell you how you write it down. I'll tell you what criteria you need to measure, because I'm a recruiter with 12 years of experience. Like I would never tell a hiring manager to use Python because I downloaded his app. I wouldn't do that. And it would be absurd. So for me, I get a bit passionate about this. Like I want to work with hiring managers, but we need to know where the boundaries are. And for me, the boundaries are, we know recruitment. They know what they need. Let me cook the meal. Sit down, wait for the meal, enjoy yourself. Is that spicy enough? I don't know.
It is, in that I feel like it's so far from what the norm is. I always say, let the specialists do their special job. They're hired. Every person at the company is hired for a reason. Or if you're a really small startup, maybe you're hired for 10 different reasons. But there's a reason that you are in the position that you're in, and that somebody else is a VP or a technical lead or whatever the case may be as like a hiring manager. And that doesn't mean that they have full understanding of recruiting and the recruiting market. And so partnership is definitely needed, but I think operationally, hiring managers can sometimes create bottlenecks that hinder recruiting teams from doing the best job that they know that they could do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that was a much more diplomatic way of saying that. So thank you. I need you in my hiring manager meetings. And I understand, especially when I work with growing companies, a lot of hiring managers have had to take on considerable responsibilities.
Yes.
But then when the company starts to professionalize, and as you say, more specialisms, people like we have individuals that are more specialists. That's the same for TA. That's the same for recruitment. And as you say, let the specialists do specialist work and let that benefit the business and be force multipliers, not bottlenecks.
100%. I've learned to be more diplomatic over time. If you ask anyone early career for me, they would not say the same thing about me. We're all a work in progress, right?
Absolutely. I think I've done it the other way. I've done like a distribution curve. I wasn't very diplomatic. And then when I got to that kind of mid-manager level, I had to be very diplomatic. Yeah. And now people kind of pay me for my consultancy and strategic advice. I can just give it to people straight again, which I think is much more close to my personality.
It would be to mine as well. Well, I think we're coming up on our time. Can you tell us where people should go to learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, LinkedIn. Hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm not trying to sell anyone anything. I've got a job. Thank you very much. I don't need to sell anyone anything. So I'm just in it for really interesting conversations. I post things every day about recruitment operations, low-level practical stuff that will help recruiters do their job a bit better.
I see you out there hustling.
Out there hustling with nothing to sell. What a silly reason. What all the work with no payoff. Why am I doing that? For fun, I suppose.
Yeah. Personal brand. It pays off in the end.
Yeah. I hope so.
Right. Well, Luke, thanks so much again for joining us on Offer Accepted. I really appreciate you spending some time with us, and thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Offer Accepted, the podcast for ambitious recruiting professionals, brought to you by Ashby, the all-in-one recruiting platform. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and share with your TA community. We'll see you next time.